Today we're starting chapter 5, which talks about basically different ways that different molecules can get across the cell membrane. Specifically today we'll be talking about passive transport. So passive transport is any type of transport in which a molecule is moving across the membrane along its concentration gradient when no energy is required. So if a molecule is moving across the membrane and no energy is required, that is passive transport. There are some different types of passive transport we'll talk about today. Diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and then there are two different types of facilitated diffusion that we will talk about. First is diffusion. So diffusion is simply the movement of molecules from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So you can see in this image here that we have a higher concentration here. We have more molecules and a lower concentration here. And the molecules are simply going to move from the higher to the lower concentration. This is diffusion. The concentration gradient is a term that we use to describe the movement of the molecules or the direction that they move. So the concentration gradient here is represented by this arrow. This is the direction of the gradient. And you can think of this as similar to being like a river. So a river flows from a high area to a low area, just like the concentration gradient flows from a high concentration to a low concentration. Equilibrium is another term we use when we're talking about diffusion. Equilibrium just means that the entire area is balanced. So there's an equal amount of the molecule throughout the entire area. What happens is that when you have a higher concentration and you have diffusion across a concentration gradient to a lower concentration, eventually the two sides balance out. This is called equilibrium. It is important to note that during diffusion, the molecules are moving in the direction they do because they constantly are in motion due to their kinetic energy. All molecules are constantly in motion. And these molecules bounce off each other, and they bounce off the sides of their container, and eventually they just naturally spread out and have an equal distribution throughout the entire space. Note that even though they're at equilibrium, so for example, they're at equilibrium now, the molecules are still moving. But once they hit equilibrium, they stay at equilibrium. Question number 1, which arrow shows the correct concentration gradient for the molecule below? A or B? Question number 2, which solution below is at equilibrium? A, B, or C? When we're talking about diffusion, we can also talk about diffusion across membranes. When molecules are moving across membranes, they are moving along their concentration gradient. However, not all molecules can move across the membrane. If you remember this picture, we have some molecules that can move across the membrane and can just diffuse through the membrane. We have other molecules that require specific proteins to help them get through the membrane, and even other molecules that cannot cross the membrane at all. So even though the molecules can move across the membrane or are moving across the membrane along their concentration gradient, there are different ways that they use to get across. To pass through a membrane, to directly diffuse through the membrane, a molecule must be very small and it must be soluble in lipids. That means it must be nonpolar. So nonpolar molecules, those are molecules without charges, are soluble in lipids. So these are the requirements a molecule needs to be able to pass through the membrane directly. Things that cannot pass through the membrane directly are either very large molecules or they are polar molecules or molecules that have a charge. Question number 3. Which of the following can pass through a cell membrane by diffusion? Choose all correct answers. So from A, B, C, D, and E, choose all correct answers. And this image here will help you. So that wraps up our discussion about diffusion. Now we're going to talk about osmosis. Osmosis is very similar to diffusion. In fact, it is diffusion. However, anytime we have water molecules that are diffusing across a membrane, we call this osmosis. So osmosis is basically the diffusion of water molecules across a membrane. And the water, again, is moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration until it hits equilibrium. There are three different terms we commonly see with osmosis: hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic. Hypotonic simply means that the concentration outside of the cell is lower than the concentration inside of the cell. Hypertonic means that the concentration outside of the cell is higher than the concentration inside the cell. And isotonic means that the concentration outside of the cell is equal to the concentration inside the cell. In a hypotonic solution, because the concentration of solute outside the cell is lower and the concentration of solute inside the cell is higher, the solute will move along its concentration gradient. So the solute would move out of the cell, however, the water would move in. So if we have a higher concentration inside, that means we have more solute per water molecule. So that means we have a relatively lower number of water molecules than we do outside the cell. So there's more water outside the cell here, less water inside. So the water is going to move in the cell. In a hypertonic solution, we have the opposite. So we have a higher concentration outside the cell. That means that there's less water outside, relatively speaking, than there is inside. So in this case, the water will actually move out along its concentration gradient, and the solute would move in. And then in an isotonic solution, since the amount or the concentration of solute is equal inside and outside the cell, there is no net movement of solute or water. So water can move in and out, but there's no net difference. It will move out just as equally or just as often as it moves in. Some ways you can remember these three terms. Hypotonic. So again, this is when the concentration outside the cell is lower than the concentration inside. Hypo, the prefix hypo, means low. So think of hypothermia. That's a low body temperature. So in hypotonic, the concentration outside is lower. Hypertonic, hyper, the prefix hyper, means high. So think of hypercardia. That means a fast heart rate. In a hypertonic solution, the concentration outside the cell is higher than the concentration inside. And then iso and an isotonic solution, they are equal. Question number 4. Label the following solutions as hypertonic, hypotonic, or isotonic as compared to the cell. For A, B, and C, label the solution as hypertonic, hypotonic, or isotonic. Question number 5. A hypertonic solution has a higher, lower, or equal concentration compared to the inside of a cell. B, a hypotonic solution has a higher, lower, or equal concentration compared to the inside of a cell. And C, an isotonic solution has a higher, lower, or equal concentration compared to the inside of a cell.